All right, good evening and welcome all those who are on the recording. And Andy hasn't jumped on just yet, so we'll greet him in a little bit here. We are beginning a new class today. We're going to be taking a look at the Epistles of St. John. That is 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. You may know them as the really short ones in the back of the Bible. We're not all the way at the back, but we're pretty darn close. Today we will cover not only just a general introduction into John's epistles, but we'll also look through an entire one of those epistles. We'll look through 2nd John today. And that may seem strange that we're starting with 2nd John, but there is a reason, and hopefully it will make sense. So let's begin then with just general background. Of course, John, the disciple, right? So this is not John the Baptist, right? John the Baptist was dead before any of the Bible, or any of the New Testament, rather, was written. But John the Apostle is responsible for writing 5 books of the New Testament, 5 books of the Bible. His Gospel, of course, his 3 epistles, and then the Apocalypse of St. John, or the book of Revelation. Now, there's all sorts of different discussions and debates. These are things that people write papers and PhDs and that sort of thing about, as to when John wrote, why John wrote, what was going on. And so what I want to do is start out by kind of giving you the argument that I have been persuaded by for how John wrote, the historical timeline of John writing his epistles. So these are not just the epistles, all of his works, rather. So John obviously was a disciple of Jesus. He was the only disciple that we know for sure died a natural death. There's one other disciple, and that's Levi, who might have not been martyred, but he probably was. But just because John wasn't martyred doesn't mean that he wasn't persecuted. And if we're getting rid of the fantastical stories about John being boiled alive in oil, but the oil didn't burn him, and tried to be poisoned with a poison chalice, and then the poison jumped out of the cup, and these fantastical tales, what we can be very certain of is that John was exiled to the island of Patmos. In all likelihood, quite frankly, he took Mary, the mother of Jesus, with him into his exile. As you'll remember, on the cross, Jesus told John, right, behold your mother, mother behold your son, essentially putting Mary into the keeping of John.
He was exiled that early?
Early enough. I don't know the exact date. I don't think we do know the exact date. The number that's in my head, although I didn't write anything down, is around 70 AD. But the main reason why we think Mary came with John into his exile on Patmos is that Mary's grave is on Patmos. I know that one of the times we talked about this, there was a group that had gone to the Holy Land on the last Israel trip we did like 5 years ago. I think they visited Patmos on that trip, and you can go and see Mary's grave. Of course,
where's Patmos?
It's an island in the Mediterranean. Kind of off the yeah. It's off the coast of Turkey. I couldn't find it on a map, quite frankly. What was that?
I haven't been there.
Have you seen the? Well, we say tomb, right? Of course, if the Catholics are to be believed, her body isn't there. She was assumed bodily into heaven, but we don't necessarily believe that. But whether or not Mary was with John on Patmos, John was on Patmos. He was exiled there at some point later in his life, but certainly not at the end of his life. And what we know for certain is that he wrote his Apocalypse. He wrote the book of Revelation while he was in exile on Patmos. We know that because he tells us that. Go ahead.
Real quick, Patmos, was that like a prison, like an exile, or did people actually live there and there were cities and such along?
People lived there.
Okay.
John was not sent to like a penal colony.
Okay.
Or anything. That's not what this was. See, I think we don't tend to, in the modern world, at least in the modern American world, certainly, we don't really get exile. Like, it doesn't click with us. Like in the Roman era, for example.
So that would be considered a really rural place to be, perhaps.
Yeah, but the punishment of exile in the ancient world was oftentimes considered worse than death. Most people would prefer to be executed rather than exiled. A lot of this has to do with the view of honor and these sorts of things, especially for Roman politicians. To be exiled was the worst possible thing, although sometimes exiled Romans were recalled and did their own thing, but that's a Roman history sort of deal. But really, to be exiled meant that you were cast out from the city. You were on your own, essentially. You didn't belong to a community. So oftentimes, depending on where you were and the situation, exile did mean death. It just meant death out in the wilderness.
Exile wouldn't be specifically to Patmos. It could be anywhere away
Not necessarily.
from the
That's
general
right.
community that they're exiling.
Yeah, a lot of the Roman senators were exiled to like Sardis. So no, and it's not like Australia was a British penal colony,
Gotcha.
Or was it Georgia? I don't know. One of the U.S.
Georgia.
It was Georgia. That's what I thought. Look at that. See, I got to learn my Georgia history now that I moved here. Georgia was initially another one of these, right, where the British would send prisoners to these particular places. That's not what exile was.
Okay.
Exile was essentially you can't come back. Now, you were typically, at least at this point in time, you were exiled to a particular place. You go there. John was exiled to Patmos, specifically. Napoleon was exiled as well. Was that?
Elba.
Thank you. Yeah. To various, they're usually islands.
Okay.
It's good to exile important people to islands because they can't do a whole lot if they're on the island. Like we do know, John was still in correspondence with the churches that he was bishop over when he was on Patmos. He wrote them a Revelation. The book of Revelation was a letter initially, and it was sent from Patmos to these other people. So John was removed into exile, but it's not like he was in prison. That when Paul is in prison in Rome, he's under house arrest, right? There are guards in his house. He cannot leave. That's a different sort of situation than exile.
Thank you for clearing
Yeah, that's important, right? So John had freedom. He couldn't leave Patmos. If he left, he could be killed. But he wasn't a prisoner in the typical sense.
He could go.
Right, he could go anywhere on the island he wished. He could conduct normal life there, but he couldn't leave. Right. And so it was during his exile on Patmos that he writes and circulates his Apocalypse. That was directed specifically to 7 churches. Those churches being the named congregations in the beginning of the book. So Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. These are all congregations, cities, but congregations specifically that were that John was supervising as bishop. He was effectively a bishop. He probably didn't use that term. In fact, we're going to talk about the term he probably used to describe himself or his office, but he was essentially what we would call a bishop over Asia, and particularly these 7 cities. So, in the argument that I have taken up, the Apocalypse is the first book that John writes. So he hasn't written his gospel or his epistles yet. John did not die in exile. He was allowed to return from exile, and it is upon his return that John sees the need for him to write his epistles. And there are really 2 reasons why John needs to write his epistles. One, he's starting to get older, and so he needs to write things down to make sure what he has to say kind of sticks in perpetuity, right? And the specific event that causes John, that John seems to require the need to write, is that there's strife and false teaching that's creeping into the church. Specifically, the church is under his ecclesial purview. And so, first John writes the book of Revelation, then he writes his 3 epistles. That's going to be the focus of this class. It isn't until John has finished his epistles and that he writes his gospel as his last will and testament. With this view in mind, John actually doesn't technically finish his gospel. The final chapter of John, and if you read it, it kind of fits, but the final chapter of John then would have been written by one of the elders, kind of as a appendix and a closing, this is what John wrote sort of thing. And so this is, not everyone agrees with this ordering of authorship, but I have been convinced that this is the order in which John wrote the things that he wrote. The epistles then, he writes a general epistle, right? So this is different than what Paul does. Right? Paul's epistles are sent to very particular places. Romans, Corinthians, right? John's epistles are sometimes called the Catholic epistles because they were sent to a whole bunch of different places. They were meant to go to all of the different churches that were under John's purview, if you will. And so 1 John then is that general epistle that John writes. Amended or attached to the epistle for each of the congregations to read was then a cover letter. That's 2 John, which is why we are going to begin with 2 John. As we'll see that 2 John seems to read as a cover letter, as an introduction to the themes and the ideas that will be discussed in 1 John. And then amended to an epistle sent to a specific individual named Gaius as kind of an appendix is 3 John, which is intended to address a very particular issue with very particular instructions. So essentially the idea would have been this. A letter would have gone around, and on the cover of it was 2 John. And everyone would have started with 2 John, because all these epistles would have been read publicly in the church. Right? Kind of like a sermon, if you will. And so they would have started with 2 John and read 1 John. There would have, depending on how this actually functioned, there would have been a number of, potentially just one, but also potentially a number of appendixes that were intended for particular individuals in one congregation. So what this is, then, is it's known as a cyclical epistle. We get bishops writing these a lot. And the intention is that when the epistle gets to the first church in the circuit, they would read it, someone would copy it down, perhaps, and then they'd package it back up and send it along to the next congregation in the loop. And then they would do the same thing there. And so this appendix then would have been, when it gets to Gaius, let him read that part. That's just for him. It's a letter that's going along with the rest of the letters. Does that make sense? It's also part of the way in which the epistles were circulated. Right? This is why we have these epistles, because they were copied down by a whole bunch of different people as they went around and as they spread throughout, in this case, Asia.
He was exiled by who?
He was exiled by the Romans. Mm-hmm.
Or his preachings and spread of Christianity.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if we know the precise events surrounding the exile, but it was for confessing and proclaiming Christ. So then the way we're going to order this class, essentially, is we're going to read through 2 John as a cover letter. We're going to do that today. And then we're going to go through 1 John, and we'll close the class out with 3 John as an appendix. And who knows, maybe there were 20 of these appendixes that John sent out. This is the only one we got. This is the only one in the Bible, therefore. So questions as to this timeline background information as to what's going on with John. All right. So, why did John write this epistle? So I've already kind of touched on this briefly insofar as there was a problem, right? Which tends to be why these epistles are written. So what was it? The issue that had come up was that there were heretics that were forming within the church, specifically. These are heretics, church members that were falling away from the faith. They were being influenced by outside ideas, particularly, we don't know all the details, but we can guess. The outside ideas seem to be Greco-Roman philosophy. And these ideas were leading the faithful away, right? So individuals were becoming Christians, and then they were leaving the faith following after these heretics. John calls these heretics the Antichrists, because they preach a different Christ and a different faith. We're going to talk briefly about that word later on today when we encounter it in 2 John. So, what were these heretics? The primary error of the Antichrist comes in two forms. The first issue is a Christological error, and the second is a moral or ethical error. So, the Christological error seems to be one of a proto-Gnostic sect. So this goes back to, well, I guess, this class last year, our parade of heretics. Don't know exactly the details of the heretics. We know that there are issues with what they're teaching. And they're, quite frankly, they're probably not quite as well defined or formed as anything we talked about last year. We do know that the denial of the incarnation of the divine Logos is central. So there's a denial that Jesus became incarnate, right? It's an appropriate time of year for us to be talking about this. Likely an early group that would become the Docetists. Now, bonus points for anyone who remembers who the Docetists were, because we didn't talk about them in the class. That's all right. The Docetists were the ones that taught that Jesus only appeared to be human. Their name comes from the word dokeo, to appear. This is the hologram Jesus, if you remember those kind of quippy ways to understand the errors. So Jesus was really walking around. Well, that's a bit of an anachronism as far as they were concerned, but Jesus wasn't in a body. He had something that appeared to be a body, but it wasn't really a body, because the spiritual, especially God, cannot become or cannot join itself to the physical, right? This is that Greco-Roman sort of worldview that was going along. So, not only the reason why we think that it's a proto-docetic group is because these themes are picked up and dealt with not only in the epistles, but also in John chapter 1, right? That famous verse or section that we read every year at Christmas, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, is a direct stab at this idea that God would not become man, right? It is very fundamentally saying, yes, God became man. Additionally, part of the reason we think it's the Docetics in particular is that a guy named Ignatius, who's a bishop in the same area, about 50 to 100 years later, addresses the Docetics directly. So it seems like they're still being dealt with in the decades to come. And so they're likely the group that was an issue. Additionally, oh yeah, come on in.
We're on the Advent schedule.
Oh, that's yeah. It is a different time than the Advent classes. Perfect time. We're just finishing our background, and we're about to dig into 2 John. Additionally, these heretics seem to have ethical errors as well. And we'll see these as we go through the text. There are clear claims to sinlessness. You'll recognize this from our liturgy when we hit the, if we claim to be without sin, the truth is not in us. That comes out of these epistles. There's a seemingly claim from these heretics that they are closer to God than others, that they claim to love God, yet they do not love one another. And love will be a major theme of John and in these epistles. They also seem to claim special knowledge of God. Again, that's kind of harkening back to that Gnostic idea. In fact, all of these are errors that are hallmarks of the Gnostic sects. So, any questions on the background while Joe comes in and joins us here?
How long was he supposedly on Patmos?
I'm not entirely sure. That doesn't mean that we don't know, it just means that I don't know. Joe, any idea how long John was on Patmos?
No, he did get off of it and went back to Ephesus, which is, at least according to legend or history, depending on how you count it, is where he died.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't get the impression that it was very long. I think he was already elderly when he was sent there, and I think the Romans just decided he wasn't worth keeping.
Right.
Wikipedia seems to imply the Roman that exiled him there died or lost his position, so the guards that were ensuring he stayed there really didn't care.
That's entirely possible. I mean, that sort of thing, right? The political prisoners stop being political prisoners when the politician dies, right? At least in the Roman era, that does.
He was there at least one Sunday.
Right? Yes. So the reason he said that is because Revelation begins with, "I was in the Word on the Lord's day," right? Or I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, which meant he was reading the Bible on Sunday. So he was there for at least one Sunday. All right, so open up to 2 John, and we will begin there. And in fact, because it is only 13 verses, what I want to do is I want to have a volunteer to read through the whole epistle for us. Is there anyone willing to read 13 whole verses? All right, Katie, take it away.
Starting at greeting.
Yes.
The elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth, because of the truth that abides in us and will be with us forever. Grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Father's Son, in truth and love, walking in truth and love. I rejoice greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as we were commanded by the Father. And now I ask you, dear lady, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but the one we have from the beginning, that we love one another. This is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, just as you have heard from the beginning, so that you should walk in it. For many deceivers who have gone out into the world, those who do not profess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh, such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Watch yourselves, so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win a full reward. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teachings of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting, for whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works. Final greetings. Though I have much to write you, I would rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and talk face to face, so that our joy may be complete. The children of your elect sister greet you.
All right, thank you. So you have now taken part in a more traditional way of understanding the epistles, which was listening to them as they were read to you, start to finish. And it's easier to do that with a 13-verse epistle than with a 13-chapter epistle. So this is a good one to do it with. So, why do we think 2 John is a cover letter? Well, It contains all the classic hallmarks of an epistle, which, quite frankly, I've always found to be rather dull, so we don't need to go through the details of what those are. But what is interesting is many of those classic hallmarks aren't present in 1 John.
Oh, no.
However, I'm on the tail end of a cold, and so talking is not great. But we will get through it.
He's got coffee.
I do. I got about 6 in my pocket. So, although I'm not sure if they're doing me any good right now. So, 1 John doesn't read as an epistle if 2 John isn't a cover letter. Although 2 John is a cover letter, then it has all the hallmarks of the epistle. Additionally, 2 John introduces all the major themes of 1 John without going into any detail into any of them. Although John will, in the main body of the epistle, in 1 John rather, John will expand on these ideas that he's brought up here. And so 2 John then anticipates the themes of 1 John without elaborating on them. And so that's why at least I've become convinced that 2 John is a cover letter. Which is, to be fair, not something everyone agrees with. But Dr. Schuckard, if you're interested, is the professor that makes this argument. He wrote the commentary on the 3 epistles of John. He was one of my professors, and I will say I don't agree with all of his theories, but I think he's right on this one. So, I guess you can say I take him with a grain of salt. I think he's right here. All right, so
How do you spell sugar?
I have no idea. I can show you the book after the class in my office. It's about this thick, and quite frankly, he's not a fantastic writer, so you don't need to really know that. But yeah, he had a thing. The only thing I remember from his class, which is probably not good, I probably should remember more, is he had this thing about the festal bath becoming the festal beverage in the book of John. I don't know. It was a weird. He might have been right. He might have been right. I just couldn't get over the ridiculous imagery that he was using. Anyway, so he was an interesting professor, but I think he's right about this. So let's dig into the actual text here. Let's start out with our introduction, which, for what it's worth, both he and I disagree with our headings that the editors put into the ESV. I think the introduction of the epistle is verses 1 through 4, not verses 1 through 3, although how much difference does that actually make? Not really any. But can I have a volunteer to read through just verses 1 through 4 this time, not the whole thing?
The elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love and truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth, because of the truth that abides in us and will be with us forever. Grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, Father, Son, and truth and love. I rejoice greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth just as we were commanded by the Father.
All right. So the author introduces himself as the elder. This is that official title that I gave you, or that I mentioned earlier. Whereas I've been referring to John as the bishop over this area, that word wasn't in use yet. It seems that John called himself the elder. And it seems that everyone in the region of Asia called him or knew him as the elder, because John doesn't see any reason to introduce himself more than just saying the elder. And so everyone knows who he is, which, by the way, is kind of a theme with John. In fact, part of the reason that the scriptures were canonized is because John was about to die and had died. Because it used to be, before the New Testament was around, it used to be that if you had a question about Jesus or about the faith, what did you do? Well, you just hiked your way over to Ephesus or wherever John was, and you asked him. And whatever John told you was the right answer. Because Peter and Paul, all the disciples are dead. It's just John. Well, this is part of the reason why we think that, at least I and the scholars that have influenced me, think that the gospel is the last thing John wrote. Because he said, I'm not going to be around much longer. I need to write this down. And then it is after John's death that the church collectively kind of goes, we don't have anyone to go to anymore. Everyone who knew Jesus personally is dead. So we got to start getting these gospels, start getting these epistles together. And that's a big driver for the compiling of the New Testament. So John introduces himself as the elder, and he addresses the elect lady and her children. Any guesses as to what John is referring to here?
The church and the people.
The church and its members, absolutely. The elect lady is the church, and her children are the members. And John will identify himself as a child of his elect lady as well. So John is not saying, oh, well, I am the elder, then there are these elect ladies, and then there are all of you children, right? John is identifying himself as being under the church as well. But he does use that elect lady to refer to the city church, and the sister then, which he uses at the end of the letter, as... Well, and we use this in the prayers, right? Every once in a while we'll say, and for our sister congregation, Grace Lutheran Church, or whatever it may be. Say, way comes out of this. It's a way to refer to various congregations, right? The church is our mother, is a very old way of thinking about the church. The church gives us life and nourishes us in the one true faith, right? We already got that. Look at that. You guys are doing well.
The feminine quality of the church.
Right, yeah.
We're doing Song of Solomon. You know, there's like the three different interpretations of that. It's like, I mean, it could be just man to his wife. It could be God to the church. And it could be God to us.
Right? The church is the bride of Christ. And so this is where the guys have to do that slightly uncomfortable thing that the women have to do all the time, which is we have to put ourselves in the place of the women. We get to be the bride of Christ, just as we are all sons of the Father, right? That was an epistle, or is an epistle coming up, something like that. And so the imagery is intended to be there, which is, for what it's worth, and I've met guys that are really hard on this sort of thing, but kind of how certain translations will say, you are all sons and daughters of the king. It's okay, right? Because we all understand what that means. But if we're going with what the original intent is, you want to be a son of the king, not quite as much the daughter of the king, right? Because who gets to inherit everything in the kingdom? Is it the son or the daughter? It's the son, right? And so just as, although interestingly enough, I don't think any of these translations say that we are the brides and husbands of Christ. It's like, no, we're just the bride of Christ, right? So, now, that being said, one of the pastors that I worked under, he would leave words out of certain translations. If it said son and daughter, he would say son, and he would make a point about it. I don't know if that's worth doing, but now I've told you, so now you can be very haughty next time you see that and say, ha, I'm better than the editors of the NIV. All right, so John then addresses the churches in truth. He addresses them in truth and in love. This is the very beginning of John beginning to wind these two themes together. And they are going to be the major theme of his epistle. Truth and love. And what John is going to essentially argue throughout 2 John and especially 1 John is that truth and love are inexorably linked. You cannot separate the one from the other. The idea being, right, if you love but you have no truth, you are not loving. If you have the truth but you do not have love, you do not have the truth, right? And John will make this argument, but we're seeing even now that John is binding together these themes of truth and love. And recognizing then that it is truth and love which not only bind us and God, but also bind congregations together as well. Questions? All right. We may actually finish on time today. I have a volunteer for verses 5 through 7, please. Thank you, Mark.
And now I ask you, dear lady, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but the one we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, just as you have heard from the beginning, so that you should walk in it. For many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist.
All right. So, starting to get into the meat of what John is talking about here. Again, though, we're all in introduction form today. So John begins by making quite a bold claim that what he is teaching is not new, right? And this is a good theme, right? I've been told many times that if you, at least in the area of theology, are doing something novel, you are on shaky ground, at the very least, right? In fact, this is one of the things that plagued Luther. Initially, early on in the Reformation is, am I making this up? Is this brand new? Is this something the church has not thought or taught for 1,500 years? Because if that's the case, you're in trouble, right? If the Holy Spirit wants the church to know something, it will not take it 2,000 years to let the church know, right? And so, now, we've talked about this a little bit in our confessions classes, but the Reformers then take extreme pains to identify what we are teaching is not new, right? We are not teaching the new thing, you are teaching the new thing. John's doing the same thing here. John is saying, I'm going to tell you something. What I'm saying isn't new. What these heretics are saying, that's the new stuff. Right? Where, in fact, do John's instructions come from? Close.
Commandments.
Okay, the Ten Commandments. Before that, we're still in verse 4 here. My voice is having a hard time, so I'll make you answer.
God.
God the
Father.
Well done. Yes, God the Father, right? Who sent the commandments, all that sort of thing, right? Rather, it is the teaching of the heretics that is new. It is not the teaching of John, right? John then identifies love as the chief condition of the believer, right? Right? This is the commandment we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. That is the chief condition of the believer. Love is an active choice of the believers. It's an active choice to move toward one another and to see to each other's needs. Right? I mean, we see this throughout the book of Acts in particular, that the congregation is coming together and seeing to the needs of the widow, the orphan, the fatherless, all of that sort of thing. And of course, as we've said, love is directly linked to what?
Trust.
Truth. Truth. In this case, that teaching of the Father, right? That command of the Father. So John is already, again, beginning to wind love and truth into one. Essentially saying there are two sides of the same coin, right? You can't have one without the other. Right, and then of course in verse 7, John begins to warn against deceivers, right? These are the ones who deny the incarnation, right? Do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. And in doing so, they not only deny the truth, but they also deny love. If you deny truth, you deny love. If you deny love, you deny truth, right? Don't worry, we got 7 more chapters of John's epistles to go through. We'll get there. Now, John then gives these heretics a name. It's a very dramatic name, at least in today's world, what does he call them?
Antichrist.
Antichrist. Bum, 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 right? Now, we need to deal with that word a little bit so that we understand what's going on. For what it's worth, the term Antichrist is only found in 2 books of the Bible. 2 John and...
Revelation.
No, it is not in the book of Revelation. But that's what everyone thinks. Now, for what it's worth, in the book of Revelation, there is the deceiver. There are references that are very similar to the Antichrist. But the word Antichrist is never used in the book of Revelation. What's the other book? Any guesses?
2 Thessalonians.
No.
Daniel.
No, it's the New Testament.
Oh, not Isaiah, the New Testament.
Yep.
Come on, Bad Lily.
You guys are trying too hard.
Matthew?
1 John. 1 and 2 John are the only 2 books of the Bible that use this term Antichrist. So, what then is the Antichrist? Well, quite frankly, asking the question that way is misleading. We tend to think of the Antichrist because of movies like The Omen and stuff like that, right? But that is not how John uses the term. It is not a particular thing you should be looking for.
Couldn't you just say ungodly?
Well, the word Antichrist is used. Well, we'll get to it. It's a good term. It just has. It has been taken. It sounds dramatic, and it's been taken up in a dramatic way. But understanding Antichrist as the Antichrist is a poor way to understand it. We are not to look for the Antichrist. John doesn't warn us here about the Antichrist. He warns us about an Antichrist. Right? So this is a better way to think about it. Is that we don't look for one in particular Antichrist. We look for anything. A plurality of things that are Antichrist. What does that word mean? What does it mean to be Antichrist?
Against Jesus. Or
Anything against Jesus,
Trinity.
absolutely. Right? So in this case, that Antichrist is one who denies the incarnation. Right? Luther will rather infamously use the term Antichrist to describe the Pope in the Reformation era, because the Pope is the one who is doling out, well, it's more complicated than this, but the Pope is the one who's doling out forgiveness of sins.
Selling indulgences.
Right, selling indulgences and doing other things. And essentially Luther says, hey, if you are taking the place of Jesus in forgiveness of sins, you are against Christ, and therefore you are an Antichrist. Right? There are Antichrists all over the place today, right? Any false teacher is an Antichrist, right? So on the one hand, let's not be so dramatic about this word, this term. Right, it's not the Omen, right? There's not some child named Damien who has 666 tattooed on his head and there are knives in the Vatican or something like that. I don't know. On the other hand, we should take Antichrists very seriously because they are directly opposed to the faith.
Is there anything between an Antichrist and a heretic?
No, I would say no. A heretic is an Antichrist.
Isn't an Antichrist a heretic?
Yes, I think. Yes, I think that works. I don't think you have to do the whole. Not all Antichrists are heretics, or I don't think you have to. Maybe I'm not
unless
sure.
you think you have to be right in your Christian beliefs, and you're not.
Well,
You're a heretic, not necessarily an antichrist. I don't know.
so let me refer you to the first class of our Parade of Heretics series that I taught a year ago. We have 3 categories. There's Orthodox, Heretic, and then there is one in the middle called Heterodox. But I taught that a year ago, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on that today. There's a point where you're wrong, but not super wrong, right? Fine lines. That one. Like, for instance, we would say the Baptist Church is a heterodox church body. They're wrong about a lot of stuff, but they're still going to heaven, so they're not heretics, right? Anything you want to add?
I don't have BDAG with me, but to check it out. But I'm thinking John may have coined the term, and it's then becomes used later by other writers based on what he says. The idea of this representing a person is a common idea in apocalyptic literature.
Right.
Even Qumran talks about the man of lies.
Right, and you have the great deceiver and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, it was a little mean of me to lead you up with the Revelation thing, right? There is some of that sort of imagery in the book of Revelation, although Revelation is not nearly as exciting as you all think it is, right? In fact, you guys know this now. You know at least one part of it, right? It's just the Christmas story. It's this whole red dragon and all that. It's just the nativity, right? Revelation is not as exciting as you think it is. It's an amazing book, but it's not as dramatic as you think it is. Or at least, it's not as dramatic as certain people think it is.
Paul tends to tie it down to a specific person a lot more than John does.
Right.
He refers to the man of lawlessness. But John uses a much more generic definition.
Right. I thought I had another reference here. No, look at that. We covered everything I had for this section. So are there any questions for verses 5 through 7? Are we all good on the Antichrist thing? I'm sorry, it's not as exciting as it could be, right? I enjoy The Omen for what it's worth. I do like that movie. Right, but...
and he will make the point in first John that many antichrists are out there.
Right, they're all over the place, yeah. And remember, everything, all these themes, all these ideas that we're covering in 2 John, this is introduction, right? He's going to, in 1 John, say, okay, let's talk about these Antichrist things, right? I mean, imagine, it's probably likely that John coined this term Antichrist. So imagine being in one of these first century shoes, right? Where someone reads Antichrist up there and you're like, Antichristoid, well, that's a weird thing. Wonder what that's all about, right? Because they don't have the Omen in their mind. And then, well, okay, here we go. 1 John. Now John's going to explain what in the world he's talking about. Although, my guess is that throughout the rest of this letter, because it's already kind of identified, hey, these are the people who deny the incarnation, right? People's minds are already going, it's like, oh, that guy we had preached the other day who said some weird stuff, that might be who John's mad at, right?
Imagine them being like, oh, John, with his PC terms, Antichrist.
I doubt that was going to be good. So can I have a volunteer to read verses 8 through 11, please?
Watch yourself. Well, I picture my roommates. Watch yourself.
I'll start calling on people.
I'll read.
Thank you, Bill.
Watch yourself so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win their full reward. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teachings of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring his teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting, for whoever greets him takes part in his wicked work.
All right. So, John here is warning us in a pretty strong way to guard ourselves. Warns us against falling away. And most specifically here, tells us to be on guard against heresy. Right? Rather, continue in truth and love, working against the heretics, is the idea that he is pushing here. Right? So what I want to do is I need another volunteer to read just one verse. So this is the shortest reading that we're going to have, but it is in a different part of the Bible. We're going to read actually another section written by John in his Gospel, John chapter 6, verse 29. So the question here is, what is this working that John is talking about, right? He says, Watch yourselves so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win the full reward. What is that work?
Jesus answered them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent." So they said to him, "Then what sign do you do, that we may see and believe you? What work do you perform?"
All right, you read an extra verse, but it's always good to read more Bible. So, right? This is the work of God, that you believe in him who he has sent. What is the work of a Christian? What is your primary work? We actually talked about this in the Augsburg Confession class. What is your work?
Spread the news of the gospel.
Witness.
No, not witness. That's not what that's not what Jesus says here.
Truth of love.
What does that look like? Where does that come from?
Serving men, people.
Love your neighbor as yourself.
These are all good things, but they're not the right answer.
What's the question again?
What is the work of the believer? Bill, can you read it to us again? Just verse 29.
Jesus answered them, "This is the word of God, that you believe in him."
Believe.
and
Believe. Right. I find this interesting, and Joe and I shared a little spark there because I think he does too. Because as Lutheran as you all are, we have this inborn tendency to think that believing is not work. And what I mean by that is like, well, yeah, I believe, but now I have to go do something. Right? I have to go love my neighbor. I have to go tell my neighbor. And again, these are all good things. But what is the work of the Christian? The work of the Christian is nothing apart from believing. That is the work that you do, right? You don't earn anything with God. None of that. Your work is faith. That's it. Right? And of course, we remember that faith is the gift of the Spirit and all that kind of stuff, right? But the work of the Christian is the work of belief. That's it. It's as simple as that. But we tend not to we just don't think that way. Right? It's not necessarily that we like it or we don't like it. It just isn't a natural way for us to think.
But I think then we tend to take it a little bit further and say, and then because of your belief, you do this.
And that's not incorrect, right? So Paul talks about the fruit of this faith. Is it John or Jude or James? It's one of these later epistles that talks about bearing fruit in keeping with repentance.
Well, that's John the Baptist.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Well, anyway, so it wasn't an epistle.
and don't think to say we have Abraham as our father.
Yes.
Yeah.
So right, it is true to say that that faith bears fruit, right? But I think what we can miss is the natural nature of that bearing fruit. So, if you believe, you will bear fruit. It's not the tree doesn't have to work to bear fruit. It just does. The healthy tree bears fruit. The repentant soul bears the fruit of repentance in their life. And so, yes, things come out of this work of belief. There are factors that impact the rest of your life, that change things, that flow out from it. But they're not fundamentally different than belief. Does that make sense?
I just confused myself.
Okay, good.
Faith without works is dead.
Right. That is, yeah, I knew that one was James.
You can't believe unless you have faith. Right? Or not right? I don't know.
No, well, yeah, I think that's correct. So,
faith and belief are just variation.
Yeah.
Variations of the same.
I'm the same
Oh,
concept.
okay,
Right?
good, thank you.
But we are kind of dancing on this faith works tightrope here, which is an okay place to dance, right? Because we do absolutely believe, because the Bible says it, right? Faith without works is dead. We also believe, it's in Ephesians. Oh, it's the big Lutheran one that I really shouldn't know off the top of
Are
my
you gonna
head.
say about how?
The good works that God has prepared
No,
before.
that's a good one, but
Yeah.
Are you gonna say how it's not we didn't save ourselves, it's not up to us?
yeah,
If our works don't make us.
these are not your own, but a gift.
Yeah, I understand what you're trying to say.
This is the remnants of the cold. I'm going to blame it on.
Too much cough, sir.
So that grace may abound.
Or not enough.
That you shouldn't boast as a gift from God.
That one, thank you. Faith is a gift, right? It's a gift from God, so that no man may boast. Thank you. So we need to. These are two verses that stand in tension with one another, right? That faith is a gift of God, free gift, so that no man may boast, and that faith without works is dead. There is a tension between these two. There's tension, and there's a lot of tensions in Scripture. This one's significant, but it's not that hard. And what we land on is, yes, works are the fruit, the sign of faith. That faith is present. But are you the one who is producing that faith? And if you don't produce the works, does that mean that you don't have the faith? Or are the works the natural output of faith?
The latter.
Right. If you have faith, you will do the works without trying. It will just occur, right? You put vinegar and baking soda in a cup, what will happen?
Yes.
Right, the volcano happens, right? It is just something that will occur. The vinegar and the baking soda don't have to go, oh, we should do this. Yes, let's make an effort, right? It is just a natural occurrence when these chemicals come together, right? In the same way, if faith is present, works will occur. It is impossible for them not to.
So going back to the cover letter, so how does that apply to life now? I mean, I can't just not talk to my roommates and scream that they're the Antichrist.
This is good. Yes, you should not do that. Look at that. Katie's looking out for you all, getting us right back on track here. Absolutely. So John does say this, right? Verse 10. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive them into your house or give them any greeting. For whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works. What is the context of what John is talking about here?
In church, isn't it?
Ding, ding, ding. This is in church. This is who you let in your pulpit.
Yeah.
Right? This is not who you are with in your work, in your your living situation or whatever it may be. Right? In fact, you can't, if we're going to say, well, you can never go to anyone who's against Christ or associate with him in any way, how are you going to do mission work? Right? I mean, you're going to have to become a hermit in the desert, right? No, John is not talking about people's personal lives here. John is talking about church. Right? And this is why we don't let just anyone into our pulpit. Right? And not saying that if we let Bill up in the pulpit that he would start preaching heresy, right? That's a different thing.
What does the pulpit mean?
Oh, the place that I preach from.
Okay.
It's just the
Podium?
Yeah, I don't know. Pulpit's a churchy word for it, I guess. Just the place the sermon takes place from.
Is that the pulpit behind the rail or not?
Yeah.
In our case, that's kind of part of the rail. It's wherever the sermon is being preached from. The piece of furniture is called the pulpit. Ours is kind of just a railing. There are some that go way up that you got to climb through a staircase like this to get into. But that's old school kind of way of doing it.
Into Old Trinity?
Not, although the church that I did my field work in had a closet in the vestry that was 3 inches deep. Because that was the door to go into the staircase to climb up 20 feet into the air and preach out of a little pillbox. I've never done it. I've heard it's terrifying, especially if you're tall. And anyway, we're getting far afield here. So no, John is not saying disassociate yourself from Antichrist, in this case, entirely. He's saying don't let them into your house. What is the house?
Church.
The church, right? I mean, very literally, now we kind of say, oh, this is God's house. Our use of the term is a little bit more metaphorical. In this day, they were probably meeting in someone's house. They were probably meeting in a wealthy individual's big house or their courtyard. That's where church was. They didn't have big church buildings. They just met people's houses. So when John says house, the very literally is probably meaning don't let them into, whoever's house you're going to, don't let them in, right? But this is more about church fellowship than it is about just your day-to-day life, right? That's what John is getting at here. Because it's not a matter of you have to just oust these people from your life entirely. That may need to happen, right? Sometimes you need to cut
I
people
wish I
out.
didn't have to talk to anybody with you guys.
Right.
They're really nice.
Yeah. But what John is dealing with here is, right, don't let heretics talk in church.
Exactly.
There is a time, though, when he refused to take a bath with a heretic.
Context is needed, please.
One of his there's a number of legends associated with John. One of them is that he was going to the public bath and saw Cerinthus, a known heretic there, and said, "Let's get out of here. The building's going to fall down."
Right, he was afraid God was going to smite him. So, yeah, that's right. Yeah, so. I mean, there's definitely, you don't want to generally associate yourself with false teachers, right? This is not a good thing to do.
Don't
Now,
take a bath with him.
but this isn't saying you need to cut all unbelievers out of your life. That's just a complete misunderstanding of what John's even talking about here, right? John is saying, and I mean, this is a relevant thing for us. It's not just, don't let false teachers up in your home. I mean, that's a big part of it, but I mean, we are very careful about whose Bible studies we use here. Because not everything that says Bible study on it is appropriate for this congregation. So we use discernment on these sorts of things for this exact reason. There are some heterodox teachers out there, or some heretic teachers out there, that we say, you know what? I don't care if a lot of Christians say they like you. You don't get to come here, right? We are not buying your stuff. We're not letting you preach, obviously. We're not letting you teach us through the books or whatever. So there's a level of discernment.
Will we still let them attend
What was that?
would we still let them attend the service?
Oh yeah, absolutely, right? Because they're not speaking, right? That's the distinction.
Do you ever call people covenant breakers?
I haven't. That's not a term we really use. No.
Curious.
Let's see. Katie got us so well on track.
I was hoping you'd say the opposite of what you did.
Sorry. Sorry.
I knew what it.
Unfortunately, we do need to be in the world. Not of the world, but in the world. Yeah. That's all right. Well, I got one more section left. So, any questions on what is it, 8 through 11 that we just covered there, which is essentially shun heretics, right?
Shun them how? Like just
From the congregation, from the teaching, because this is the issue: is that the churches are letting these heretics teach, and John says, "Don't, bad."
Can you let them take communion even if they're a heretic?
No, we wouldn't. Because
Not cast your pearls before swine.
pearls before swine, right? There's a breaking of fellowship.
Yeah.
What if they were baptized?
You can be baptized and appropriately refuse communion. There's all sorts of different reasons for that. One of them is, the Baptists baptize, but we wouldn't let a Baptist just commune at our rail because they don't believe the right things about communion. Also, in issues of moral problems, communion can be withheld because you've broken fellowship with Christ.
What about an Anglican? Would an Anglican be able to take communion?
Not with us. Their belief is pretty close with communion, but because our congregations are not in fellowship with one another, we would say, because communion is also a,
Sacrament.
well, yeah, it is a sacrament. So there are two major barriers to entry at our rail in particular. One is the belief, so proper doctrine, specifically concerning the true presence of the body and blood of Christ. Which there are a number of other, in fact, the vast majority of Christians in the world believe that. There's like 1 billion Catholics out there. So that's still happening. There are like 1 billion Catholics plus a whole bunch of Orthodox, Anglicans. Their confession isn't that, but most of that
guys
is.
don't like Catholics.
No, well, essentially they're in a different denomination. Accepting particular cases of pastoral discretion, because the second barrier to entry is fellowship, which is essentially saying we agree with each other to the point that we can be that we're the same, right?
Does your wife still consider herself Catholic?
No. So we'll talk about the Catholic Church in particular, right? Because the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church believe not the same, but very close to the same thing about communion. It's not the same, but it's pretty close. But just as a starter, Council of Trent said all Lutherans are going to hell, and Luther, as I referenced, called the Pope the Antichrist, and we haven't recanted that. And so we have some disagreements with one another that we haven't put aside. And so it's a confession of fellowship, communion that is.
Another argument would be they would be violating the teachings of their own church that says they should not commune.
Right,
The Mass.
Right, most.
Apart from the priest.
That's
Anglicans do not guard their rail very closely.
not a lot of churches
Pretty
do.
much anybody up there.
The ELC is a whole different thing. Anyway, the issue of guarding the rail is a sensitive one. It's an important one, and it tends to hurt people's feelings, which is unfortunate.
Well, I still need the truth, though.
Right, which is why it's unfortunate that people's feelings get hurt. I understand why people's feelings get hurt, but it's guarding the rail, at least in terms of fellowship that we're talking about here, is being honest with ourselves.
Yeah.
If you just let loose the gates and don't care, you're blind. You're putting blinders on, and you're saying, "Yeah, we have some real fundamental differences, but I don't care about this because I don't want to offend."
It's your truth and love thing.
Right.
We guard the truth out of love, because someone who takes communion inappropriately eats or drinks.
Condemnation upon themselves.
Yeah.
Right.
We don't want to help it out.
This isn't necessarily for class, maybe like us talking, but I'll want to know what makes Anglicans different from Lutherans.
Okay. Yeah, not for this class. Partly because I'll need to look it up a little bit. We can.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well,
the Anglicans are, from what I've discovered, are closer than a lot of Lutherans are.
Certain groups of Anglicans.
It's a similar but a different Reformation.
Yeah.
It's a Reformation in England.
Yeah.
They came out of that.
You're right. Henry VIII. So you can
A different Reformation.
What was that?
But times that were very, times that Henry VIII were very Catholic.
Henry VIII wrote Martin Luther.
Well,
said as much as
to be fair on that point, Bill, that is not something that we are immune to. Anyway, we're getting far afield here.
Sorry.
Typically I enjoy doing that, but I actually have a chance to get done in less than an hour and a half. And see, I told you, it's not always my fault. These are good conversations to have, right? Man, I really thought that'd be done by now. Final volunteer. Just 2 verses, 12 and 13.
Though I have much to write to you, I would rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and talk face to face, so that our joy may be complete. The children of your elected sister greet you.
So not a whole lot here, right? John expresses pastoral concern for these people, right? He has a lot he wants to talk with them about, and I don't think that's I got a lot I need to deal with here. John wants to be with his people. I can relate to him in that I don't think he says paper and ink, but I don't like emails either. I would much rather not have conversations over emails and talk to people face to face. But John comes out of an oral culture, which is, I think, part of the reason why he didn't write a whole lot. I mean, think about how much Paul wrote compared to John. I think John preferred just to talk to people, to be a pastor to the people. And so, right, it isn't until he gets to talk with them face to face that his joy is complete. Oral teaching is clearly favored by John. It also bears itself out in the way that John wrote, particularly his gospel. His gospel reflects a very oral style, but so do these epistles here. The idea here with this conclusion, there we go, is that John has more to say, right? This is kind of emphasizing that cover letter aspect of 2 John, is that I got more to say. I'm going to say it in my next epistle, right? I'm going to talk to you about it when I get there. Right, so study up and get ready to have a chat when we get there. And of course, as we said in verse 13, the children of your elect sister greet you. Right, so John is including himself in that children of the sister, right? Just children of the congregation. He's not elevating himself above the church or anything like that. And so in 2 John, John introduces his main themes that he's going to spend a significant amount of time on. Well, significant is a vague term for 5 chapters. Significant perhaps for John. A significant amount of time discussing. And those twin themes are?
Truth and love.
Truth and love. Good. See, look at that. One class and you guys got it. So, any questions about 2 John or the background or the history or any of that kind of stuff?
Tell us in a nutshell what an epistle is.
A letter.
That's all.
Yeah, epistle is just... no. The word epistle means letter, right? It has particular elements to it. Like I said, I always found this tedious, so I can never remember it. So maybe Joe can help me out. They always have special forms of greetings, which we see in the first chunk there. The main body, a conclusion, which has that other greeting, the salutation sort of section. It's a fairly formal type of letter that was popular in the time of the early church. The Bible is not the only place that we have epistles. I think probably the most famous epistles outside of the Bible are the epistles of Seneca, who is a Stoic philosopher. There's letters he wrote to one of his students, which are very good. I like the Stoics though. But so I mean, this is a Roman form of letter. It's a formal type of letter, but for all intents and purposes, it's a fancy, very organized letter.
It operated under its own style sheet, so to speak.
Yeah.
And similar to the idea within a corporation, memos, they have a very specific form so people can immediately get the content and they don't have to go all the way through it to figure out what's going on. Epistles were written in that kind of format. Probably the most characteristic thing is the person who wrote it doesn't sign at the end, they sign at the beginning. As the most important part, and then greet people at the end. But you got to tell people who you are, because that's what's being read. So it's a specific style that makes it an epistle.
For what it's worth, at least judging by Seneca's epistles, this is a lot closer to the average length. Paul's are really long. Again, compared to Seneca's. His are probably somewhere in the range of the Johnson epistles. If you want to read Seneca's epistles.
When
they're
Paul
very
breaks
short.
the rules, it's usually for really something that stands out.
Right. It's probably Corinthians. One of the epistles that Paul's mad at. I remember one of my Galatians. Well, here we can do it. I remember one of my professors, because we had to translate it, which I am not going to translate it, but right, so we read we read the beginning of Galatians, so we'll just read the first 5 verses, right? Paul, an apostle, not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ, God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and all the brothers who are with me to the church of Galatia. That's just the first 2 verses. To us, that's normal. I don't know what rules he's breaking, but he is breaking epistle rules, and as one of my professors said, it's as if Paul is doing this through the letter. Paul, an apostle, not from men, right? He's just beating people up with. He's writing it in such a way that to them it was obvious that he was ticked off and very angry.
All caps lock.
Right? Yeah, caps lock. So
The other thing about the epistle is basically says, "Hey, I'm Paul. I'm writing to you, Galatians, and I can't believe what you're doing.
right,
I can't believe how quickly you fell from the gospel."
Yep.
You know, he doesn't go into. I heard about your faith and your hope and your love, which is usually at the beginning of his epistles, but
he's just mad.
just jumps right in. I can't believe it.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. You foolish Galatians.
Yeah.
All right, good. Any other questions? All right. Well, then let's.
I have to wonder. It does make sense to talk about 2 persons. Why did they get ordered that way? I mean, you're putting a Bible together. If 2 seems to be the cover sheet, why is it 2 and not 1?
So there are a couple reasons. One, the fact that it's a cover sheet is a guess. It's a scholastic guess. It's an educated guess. It's one that I think is correct, but it is right. It is. We don't know that for certain because we don't have the autograph. Right. The autograph is the original. Additionally, and I wasn't going to bring this up because I talked about it during our class on the book of the Hebrews. Part of the reason, there's a longer one and a shorter. One of them is the epistles, by the way, I don't know if you knew this, are arranged by length. They're arranged by author and length. So what's Paul's longest epistle? Romans. Romans is his longest epistle. What's John's longest epistle? 1 John. Additionally, there's this issue of homolegomena and antilegomena, which are words. Do you actually remember those words, or are you? They're fun words. They're some of my favorite words. 2 more you can add to your list. So homolegomena are books of the New Testament in particular that were all spoken for. That's what the word homolegomena means. Legomena comes from logos, which is words spoken for, and homo is the same. And so those are books of the Bible, specifically the New Testament, that everyone agrees should be in the Bible. Antilegomena, then, are books that were spoken against, where a number of people said, no, that doesn't belong in the Bible, that's not in Scripture. 1 John is homolegomena. 2nd and 3rd John are both antilegomena. They were both spoken against. By the way, so is Hebrews. James was Jude, I believe, as well. Oh yeah, Revelation, definitely. Were all spoken against. There were people who said, no, that is not part of the Bible. There's criteria for why books made it in and why books didn't. For what it's worth, there were books that were spoken against that didn't make it in. We still have a number of them. The Didache, which I think you referenced earlier today, which is the teachings of the 12 apostles. The Shepherd of Hermas is another book that some people said this is the Bible, this is Scripture. but enough
Bibles that included.
Right, but there were enough people that in the process of canonization said no, and the church as a whole at Nicaea, broad strokes, at Nicaea said no, not in the Bible. So that's also part of the reason why 2 John is later. By the way, this is why Luther, if you have ever heard Luther called James the Epistle of Straw, that you should just rip it out of your Bible and burn it, it's because it was spoken against. Luther didn't like that faith without works is dead line, and so he said, well, just rip it out, you don't need it. He also wanted to rip Esther out, for what it's worth. Luther was a dramatic person. He said you can get rid of the whole Bible except for Genesis, John, and Romans. He said just read those and you're fine. He was an interesting guy. Interestingly enough, and we'll close here with this anecdotal thing. In fact, it was the same guy who did the punching thing. Right as I was finishing up seminary, I had to do an interview, not the quiz interview from a particular place that most guys had to do. They changed it right before I went through. But I had to go through an interview with the dean of students where he asked me all sorts of questions. And one of them was, in your ordination vows, you will swear to believe and teach and confess and all that, the canonical books of Scripture. And he paused me before I answered, and he said, by the way, if Dr. Veltz has his way, you can exclude the Antilegomena from this list. I was like, I'm okay with the Antilegomena too. For what it's worth, there is no, and this is important, there is no theological doctrine that is found only in the Antilegomena. If you find something in 2 John, and it's only there, you're going to have a hard time since 2 John is like a summary of 1st. But if you find something in the book of Revelation, since this is typically where it happens, and it's not found anywhere else in the Scripture, you don't get to say this is theology. The Antilegomena supports doctrine. It doesn't create doctrine. None of you need to worry about that. Because if you're making up doctrines anyway, you're in trouble. We're 2,000 years past getting to do that. But that is the case. That the fact that some books were spoken against 1,500 years ago, more than that, 1,700 years ago, does matter. We do take that into account. Which also, by the way, means that no major doctrine that you know of comes solely from those books. The one place you do see it fairly commonly is Revelation, right? Oh, we got to look for the great deceivers, like, or these helicopter locust things. So if you can only find it in the book of Revelation, you're off base. So good. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned before students would come and just hang out with Luther, and they'd all drink and have dinner, and those are
the table talks.
They're called table talks.
Yep.
Like if I looked up table talks,
You're going to find a lot of stuff.
You
Yes.
would find them.
was there a curated list of them, like the
Like of the
best
good
ones?
ones?
Yeah.
Probably.
Have you read any of them?
I think I've heard quotes from them. I don't know if I've ever sat down and read any of the table talks.
You probably have it in your Luther's.
Oh, I do. I'm sure I do have
There's a
a chunk of them.
different students would collect it, so there's collections from different students, and people would take the collections and put them together in terms of standard editions of Luther to kind of put it all together. It's Luther maybe at his most colorful, but not necessarily at his best theologically.
Right, yeah. Because as you said, there was drinking involved. Luther would teach at the pub quite frequently, or at the tavern. In fact, I'm pretty sure was it in Wartburg that they have a direct line from the brewery to the pub to pipe in so that they didn't have to have anyone deliver the kegs. I don't know.
That's
Katie brewed beer, didn't she?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You can still buy the beer that was given to Luther on his wedding day. This is a barrel of his favorite beer. I don't remember the name of it, but my vicarage, well, not my vicarage supervisor, one of the pastors of my vicarage congregation gave me a 6-pack of it for Christmas while I was there. I mean,
Is it a stout?
no, it's a German Dunkel or something like that. It's brown. So, all right, well, so that we can actually finish this slightly early,
Cool.
why don't we say the Lord's Prayer? Our Father, who art in heaven,
Hallowed be thy name.
thy kingdom come,
Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
give
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
All right, I will see you all next week where we will actually do 1 John.
I'm not confused anymore.
Well, that's good.
Do you mean here or?
Yeah, okay, so that's good since we've had some folks come. For the John epistles, we're going to meet with you. When we get to the end of it, we're going to